Patch 12.19 is upon us with some nerfs, some buffs, and some other changes too. Starting with nerfs, we have Master Yi, where his base AD per level is being reduced as well as his AD scaling on his E. The only other nerf goes to Rek'Sai, who's losing 3 base AD. The first buff goes to Echo, where he's getting more scaling on his passive damage and more flat damage as well as AP scaling on his ultimate. Next we have Fizz, who's getting additional AP scaling on their E. Following this we have Garen. The critical strike damage on his E is being significantly increased, so crits will do a ton more damage. Next we have a buff for Jinx's base AD, and her ultimate will now deal additional damage at all levels. Following this, we have a buff for Kai'Sa, where her passive execute will now scale even higher with AP. We then have a buff for Malphite, where his AP scaling on W and ultimate are being increased. Next is Nasus, where his Q is getting additional range. His W will now reduce attack speed even more, and his ultimate now makes him bigger the more levels in the ability. Following this, we have Nunu, whose ultimate will now scale 300% with AP. Next, we have a small buff for Rakan, with the AP scaling on his passive and Q being increased. Following this, we have Ryze, who is getting additional AP scaling on his Q and W. Next, we have Shyvana, whose W is getting additional AD scaling. In addition, her E will now do slightly less max health damage, but instead it gets higher AD and AP scaling. However, the additional damage from using her E in dragon form is being slightly turned down. Following this, we have Sona, whose Q is getting 10 additional damage and the slow on her power chord E is going up to 50%. Next, we have Tahm Kench, who's getting additional AP scaling on his Q and W. Following this, we have Twitch, who's getting additional AP scaling on his passive and E. And the final buff is for Udyr, with his Q, W, and R doing more against minions. We also have 2 mini reworks. Starting with Blitzcrank, his base attack speed and attack speed ratio is being increased. To go with this increase, his W will now cost slightly more mana, but will give even more attack speed early and an insane amount of attack speed when fully leveled. Also, all attacks when W is active will deal 1% maximum health damage against champions, and a huge amount of additional damage against monsters and minions. Next, his E will now cost more mana, but the knockup will be slightly longer and it now scales with AP. Also, his E does a huge amount of damage against non-champions, making his farming and jungling much easier. Finally, the passive on his ultimate can now hit unlimited times and the AP ratio is increased. These changes may well make him into a top laner or jungler. The other rework goes to Syndra. Firstly, her base health is being reduced, but she gets a new passive where she collects up to 120 splinters, which she gets when she damages an enemy champion with 2 abilities, every time she levels up and every time she kills a cannon minion. When she has 120 splinters, she gains 15% increased AP. Her Q now has a much longer cooldown of 7 seconds, however will cost less mana when leveled and has slightly increased AP ratios. Upon collecting 40 splinters, she'll be able to store 2 of these at one time. Her W has a slightly increased range, and upon gathering 60 splinters, it will deal a chunk of true damage. Her E now has a 15-second cooldown, however the stun duration as well as the flat damage and AP scaling is being reduced, but it does scatter balls at an increased angle. Upon gathering 80 splinters, the angle is increased even further and it will apply a slow after the stun. Her ultimate now has less flat damage and AP scaling, however has a new passive where it gives her Q additional ability haste. Upon gathering 100 splinters, this will now execute enemies below 15% health. In other news, Eclipse's base AD is being increased, however it's losing a lot of lethality, which is a strong nerf. Janna is getting a visual update and loads of Spirit Blossom skins.